Welcome to the Fearless Project podcast. I'm your host, and this week I speak with the director of the Public Interest Fellowship, Garrett Exner, to discuss the rising popularity in America First isolationism post October 7th. The history of America First isolationism has some context dating back to the interwar years leading up to World War II. And those who propose isolationism as the answer to our domestic issues, such as Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, lack the historic context that shows quite the opposite is true. In order for America to be first, we have to have strength abroad, and we must maintain our supremacy on the global stage. This is an important conversation, and I hope you enjoy. Garrett Exner, welcome to the Fearless Project podcast. So happy to have you back.
Great to be here.
For those who might not have seen your past episodes on the podcast, could you just give a brief introduction on your background and what you do?
Yeah, Garrett Exner. I'm the executive director of the Public Interest Fellowship. It's a nonprofit that seeks to educate young professionals as they get started in DC, whether they're working in politics, policy, or journalism. We have a number of fellowships to help educate folks on kind of the core principles, free market capitalism, a strong American foreign policy, and the protection and preservation of individual liberties, kind of our main tenets. I'm also an adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute, where I write and comment on defense policy and particularly special operations policy, counterterrorism. And then I also am a contributing editor over at Providence Magazine, where I write about history and foreign policy.
Perfect. And I actually will link your most recent piece because it does kind of fall within what we're going to be talking about today. So I'll link that below for everyone to go check out. But Garrett, today I wanted to talk about isolationism because it's become more and more popular, especially on the political right, which is a space that we occupy, to kind of support the idea that America First, quote unquote, policy means withdrawing from the international stage. So for those who might not be familiar with the term isolationism at all, or like what the policy would entail, what is isolationism in a nutshell, both historically, and then how is that morphed into a modern policy?
Well, I will also start by saying I think we have an outsized view of isolationism or the threat of isolationism in American politics and our domestic politics. I think we think that it played a much larger role, particularly in the founding, than it did, and in the first, dozen presidents, that they were predominantly isolationists. They weren't. In fact, foreign policy played an outsized role in the majority of their time spent as president. But with that said, I think there's always an idea within the American politic that we're protected by the grace of God by two large oceans. We have generally great neighbors in Canada and Mexico. So why do we need to worry about the rest of the world? But really, I think isolationism kind of ebbs and flows in the American domestic politic. It comes up at different points, and we're kind of drawn into foreign conflicts for different reasons. Kind of the same similar logic each time. And then right now we happen to be in another one of those times where isolationism is creeping up. It generally follows time periods of economic downturn domestically that we start talking more about isolation. We can't be worried about the rest of the world. The problem that it runs into every time is that the rest of the world continues to think about America and continues to involve themselves in the problems that are kind of global problems, and America gets drawn into it. So that's kind of I'd say the short answer for a very complicated, nuanced subject of kind of isolationism in American history.
I'm going to play a clip that I think perfectly encapsulates what that means for at least the right today. It's Candace Owens answering a question on, what does America First mean to her? Provide some context for the listener.
America First right now means that, or always rather, I shouldn't say right now because it's not momentary, means that we are prioritizing the concerns of America above every other country in the entire world. And I say this about whether it's Ukraine, whether it's about Israel. The American people are so tired of being sold a sappy narrative and told, hey, I know that you can't feed your kids. I know that you can't afford to put petrol in your car. See, petrol. See how I switched to my English language from American? But You should instead think about what's happening overseas on their borders. I know that your borders are completely porous. I know that there's crime in your cities, but just think what would happen if Putin beat Zelensky.
Okay, so that kind of, I think, hits the nail on the coffin for at least why a lot of people on the right are turning to isolationism as maybe a solution. Post-COVID pandemic economy, high cost of living, inflation, you have the open border, and this idea of why should we give millions abroad when we're hurting here at home. And I think it lends to the idea that domestic policy and foreign policy are somehow zero sum, which I don't believe is true. I don't know if you have kind of a response to Candace.
So I don't have a response to her directly or her as in particular as a person. I think my viewpoint is somewhat nuanced on what America First policy is. I think there's probably a pretty large difference between her view of America First and mine. I would say that for the average, say a steel worker in Northwest Indiana that was an Obama voter but is now a Trump voter, I don't think they would ever call themselves an isolationist, right? They would call themselves America First, and there's probably varying degrees of what that means to them individually. I think the only people that would call them like isolationists would be here in DC or maybe like in the Acela corridor, meaning like DC up to New York in that area. But I think generally their gripe or complaint is that I have issues and those aren't being dealt with, but I'm hearing a lot of talk about foreign issues, and that is rightly so upsetting to those people. The problem when you get into kind of the punditry, political punditry of the right that would declare themselves more isolationist, is that they're linking issues that don't have anything to do with each other. The war in Ukraine has nothing to do with our southern border. We have a terrible policy on our southern border right now. Absolutely, it needs to be fixed. That does not have anything to do with a dictator, an authoritarian invading a country in Eastern Europe, and whether or not the United States should be on the side of freedom and democracy, battling our adversary for a small fraction of our defense budget. That seems like a good economic plan for me. When we kind of look at the map of the world and we look at America's adversaries, it's an economic defense policy to invest a few, tens of billions of dollars in Ukraine to take one of our adversaries off the map. If that means I get to focus on a much larger threat in China somewhere else, and I know we'll probably get into this later and kind of what the world breakdown is, but I think generally where folks like Candace are and where a lot of Republicans are, maybe those on the right or who wouldn't call themselves Republicans, is that they just want to see domestic issues taken care of, and they're seeing foreign policy prioritized over domestic issues. I don't think those two are linked. I think it's wrong to kind of put them in the same category or say because we sent money to Ukraine means that we have to let the materials that President Trump put on the southern border to build a border wall, that those should rot or be sold or rust down there. Like those two things have nothing to do with each other. Foreign policy is foreign policy, domestic policy is domestic policy. Those two can bleed into each other in different aspects, but I think the main issue areas that we see facing kind of the heartland of America, whether it's the fentanyl crisis, or immigration or inflation, these don't have much to do with whether or not we defend Ukraine. They don't have much to do with our support for Israel. There's probably much more to do with countering China's growth in the world, which is a foreign policy issue, especially if we're talking about the fentanyl crisis, than anything else. So it's really a conflation of different issues. I have a lot of sympathy towards people who want the domestic issues taken care of. I want them taken care of as well. But it doesn't mean I can take my eye off of what our adversaries are doing around the globe, if that makes sense. So it's a long-winded answer.
No, that's perfect. And I think, well, you're in the DC policy circles. Was there as much a pushback or kind of draw to isolationism after Ukraine? Because I noticed a huge uptick in sympathy towards that policy after October 7th. And then there has been also kind of a gateway into deeper anti Semitic sentiments. Do you think it's been a growing kind of resentment towards conflict abroad since Ukraine, or why do you think the uptick since October 7th?
Well, I think things kind of started more so in Afghanistan, Iraq, right? You had the quote unquote forever wars, no more forever wars crowd, growing in numbers and in decibels. Uh, and as you saw us, the Obama administration exit Iraq and the growth of ISIS, kind of just the disaster that turned into in 2013 and 2014. And then you saw it again in 2021 in Afghanistan, and the disastrous withdrawal there. And I think a lot of Americans were left saying, what did we get for 20 years of investment? Billions and billions of dollars into these two countries. We got nothing. And then Ukraine happens, and they see tens of billions of dollars going to Ukraine, and it raised the same questions. What are we getting from this? And I don't think those who exist here in DC have done a great job explaining that to the American public, what they're getting for that. And it's a simple answer. It really is. We are, if you believe in America first, as I do, I believe America is the leader of the world. We set the order for the entire world. The next two people that are waiting to take our place, China and Russia, do not share our values. So with us in charge, it is American value system. It's free commerce of the seas, now free commerce in space, and much more, that we get to set the rules for the world because we are the dominant power. We are America in first place. I'm not willing to give that up. And that's why I want to see America engaged on the rest of the world. And that's why I don't want Russia gaining territory, gaining population, gaining resources, gaining the breadbasket of Europe, having the rest of Europe beholden to Russian energy. And I don't want to see China gaining space in the South China Sea or in Taiwan or anywhere else. I want America to be in the leadership position. I think that's the easiest way to sell it to the American public. And I think, to go back to that, anecdote of the steel worker in Northwest Indiana, they want America to be in first place too. If you went to the average person in Scranton, Pennsylvania, or in Iowa, or wherever you want to go, and you said, "Do you want America to be in first or second?" They're going to say, "I want America to be in first place." There's a famous speech by General Patton where he talks about how Americans love a winner. We love winning and we love winners. We despise a loser. That's his words, and I agree with him. We want to be in first place. America first, to me, means that America is in the leadership role for the entire world, and we need to maintain that position. The way we do that is by making sure that those who seek to supplant us, Russia, China, maybe to a lesser extent Iran, that they're kept farther down the chain. There's a very easy policy way to get that. One of the ways is to make sure that they're bogged down in their own conflicts, like in Ukraine, and that they lose when they try to grow and they try to challenge us.
I really quickly want to look to the past as kind of a warning for where we're at and talk about the interwar years leading up to World War II. There's actually a second part to that clip. And also just want to make clear for the audience, I'm not trying to respond to Candace herself, but more so the ideas that I think she represents.
In the 1930s, there was another America First movement, sort of isolationist movement, saying we mustn't go to war in Europe again after the First World War. Do you think that those America First supporters then were right? Do you think that America shouldn't have gone into that Second World War?
Yeah, and that is a radical statement. People don't know how to deal with that because we've all been so brainwashed by the school system to believe that, well, look how great things are. Let me ask you about your country. Do you think that your country has become greater since? Has our country become greater since? Absolutely not. This whole idea of international liberalism. Now it's not just about your problems, it's about solving the world's problems.
So that clip makes me laugh because she's asking a British journalist if he would be better off if the U.S. hadn't entered World War II. And the answer is no. So it's just like a blindness to the implications of her read on history is almost funny and comical. But what she's kind of talking about and what the interviewer was asking about was there was a big, America First movement here in the United States in the interwar years after World War I. Obviously, huge devastation after World War I. And then you had the Great Depression. So as you mentioned, economic upheaval and turmoil, making the American populace turn to America First policy. And it was in that vacuum on the world stage, that military vacuum, that Imperial Japan and Germany kind of made their advances into expanding both then in Asia and in Europe. Do you have any, I guess, anecdotes or, how can we learn from the interwar years for today, if there's any lessons from history?
Well, I would start by saying that maybe 2 points. Number one, the existence of a fringe party in the United States in some point in our history is not a justification for a return for those beliefs later. Just because somebody thought it once and there was a political party that had this idea doesn't make it a viable option again in the future. It didn't work then, and I don't think it'll work now. And I'm not saying the America First movement in the 1930s is much different than the America First movement now. I actually think that we're playing into kind of an argument that the left or maybe the mainstream media likes to make about Republicans, saying that these two things are the same. They are not the same. I believe that America First means that we are the leader in the world, and that I place America. There's only one flag on the moon, and I want to say that way. It's us, right? We are the world leader. That's what I believe America First is. It's not a kind of xenophobic, um, you know, isolationist policy of the 1930s. That's number one. Number two is that she mentioned the kind of liberal world order, and here's something that is just my good friend Carrie Filippetti makes this point that the liberal rules-based world order to conservatives, none of those words, kind of particularly in combination, sound good to us. The liberal rules-based world order, like that doesn't sound good. What about the American-run world order, the American-led world order? That sounds much better than a liberal rules-based, whatever that is. Conservatives generally don't want governments kind of making rules for us. We definitely don't want international organizations making rules for us. And if you place the word liberal in front of it, now you've set off kind of all the spider senses for every conservative that's out there. So I understand that she's hearing kind of the liberal based order and she's going to critique it. And I understand where that's going to come from. But I think we need to understand that her statement that America shouldn't have entered into World War II, it's not like we asked Japan to attack us at Pearl Harbor. We didn't send a letter to them and say, please strike here, please kill 3,000 Americans. This will be very good for us. That's not how this went. There was a hesitancy for America to join that war that lasted for a number of years during the outbreak of war, particularly if you were to not date the start of the war from when Hitler invades Poland, but when Japan invades China, and when Italy invades Ethiopia. Those happened much earlier than Hitler's invasion of Poland, and America is reluctant to engage at that point. But the war comes to us as it often does. There's no way to avoid the kind of global goings on of the world, particularly when there are dictatorships out there that want to establish either a regional or a global hegemony. America will eventually fall into one of those categories for one of those dictators, and we're going to have to deal with it. And that's what happened in World War II. Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, and that's what caused us to enter in the war. But we should also remember that Hitler, there's a great book on this by Charlie Lederman and David Sims called Hitler's American Gamble. I highly recommend it. Hitler is very focused on America from before the war. He is very focused as America is the place that we need to deal with. That's the greater threat because that's where capitalism and free market society and the things that are opposed to what Nazi Germany is going to stand for. Hitler says that's why we need to focus on them. And eventually we're going to have to deal with them. So this idea that we're going to obfuscate known facts of history and say that somehow the world would be better off. No, America would eventually have been brought into that war. It just, it happened because we were attacked. And ideally, it could have happened even earlier than that. If we had stepped in to kind of counter this isolationist thread, when one of the time periods where Hitler is most worried about his new empire that he's trying to build is when he moves into the Rhineland. There's actually a 24-hour period there that all the documentation shows that he's very concerned that England and France are going to step in and they're going to stop him there, and potentially America as well, are going to step in and say, you cannot do this. He's not going to remilitarize the Rhineland. And we don't, because there's strong isolationist threads that are building at that time that say we can't get into another war. World War I was so awful. We don't want to do it again. We can't get into another war. Just let him have the Rhineland. And then it moves into other areas. You see the Sudetenland go, and then you see Austria, then the Sudetenland, and then all of Czechoslovakia, and then finally it's Poland. And then at that point, Germany is a juggernaut that we're trying our best to stop. and it costs us way more in lives to try to stop it later. When if we just stopped it earlier, there's really not much of a German military to speak of when he moves into the Rhineland. So there's actually a great opportunity to stop it early if there wasn't this isolationist tendency.
And it was after World War II that America emerged as a global superpower, creating the bipolarity of the Cold War with Russia. And then after, of course, the Soviet Union fell, we were the global hegemon. But we're obviously in a historic period now where that is shifting, which is where I want to kind of turn to when we're talking about Russia and China. I think even I'm guilty of making the analogy of where we're at now with the Cold War, but the Cold War was bipolar. So you had the United States and Russia were moving towards a multipolar world. Could you explain to the audience, what that means kind of practically for the United States and what challenges come with that?
Well, I would start by saying that something that we should all baseline ourselves on is the idea that war is least likely when there's a large imbalance of power, meaning one nation is much stronger than its closest adversary. War is far more likely when there's near parity among the two powers. So we're living in a unipolar world right now where America has an outsized military compared to our next largest adversary. That is a good thing. We should hold on to that because it means that war is less likely between us and China. The closer we allow China to get to us, the more likely war becomes. And this is throughout history. You can go back to kind of Athens and Sparta, and as far back as you want to go in history, you find that this plays out to be true. So this idea that during the Cold War and it's a bipolar era, you have wars ticking off, and everyone is very concerned about the likelihood of war happening. And it'll be a nuclear war because these are two nuclear powers. Same thing as it would be if it was China and America. If we moved back into a kind of Cold War period, the unipolar world is much safer. It's a much safer world. And there's many people probably listening and say, how could you say that? There's a war in Ukraine. There's a war in Israel right now. It doesn't feel like a safer war. But these are small scale wars comparatively to wars throughout history. These are actually relatively small compared to other ones. So this is a much safer world. I would also posit that you're seeing the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel. You're seeing an uptick in violence and aggression out of America's adversaries because we're losing that imbalance, right? The imbalance that we had probably peaked in the 90s. Gulf War is a perfect example of this, where the United States is able to muster, 40 nations to go and kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, and then move back to focusing on America, kind of a domestic issues at that point, with little really effort. Right, we're able to move our forces over there, kick a dictator out of a country, free a nation, Kuwait, and then say, okay, everything's fine. America is upholding the world order. That's kind of the peak of that power imbalance. And since then, we've kind of let it erode and decline, and definitely over the last 3 or 4 years, as we've not kept up with defense spending, real defense spending, as it relates to inflation. We're actually declining in real defense dollars over the last 4 years, even though the overall number goes up, and that's what Democrats like to point to. In terms of real dollars spent on defense, we're declining, and China's growing very rapidly. So as soon as that parity hits, the world becomes far less safe than it is right now.
And I know that, does China currently have the largest navy? I think that their fleets.
They do. In terms of ships, they do. Now, there's a disparity there. We like to point to, well, we have 11 aircraft carriers. I think they're moving into the third now. This will be their first kind of true big deck without a ramp on it. That'll be kind of cable launch aircraft carrier. The difference that I see in that is that the quality. There's an argument that people like to make quality versus quantity, and they're saying, well, they have quantity, but we have quality. Well, quality actually historically doesn't line up to victory in many ways. You can look at kind of the German Tiger tank in World War II. It's the kind of pinnacle of tank technology at the time, but they're not able to produce that many of them. We produce the Sherman, which is a far lesser capable tank, smaller gun, thinner armor, but we produce Sherman tanks at a rate of 36-1, 36 Shermans for every Tiger. And on the battlefield, depending on which study you're looking at, the Tiger only outperforms the Sherman by about 2.5 to 3 Shermans per Tiger. So we're able to overwhelm them just with quantity. So China's Navy being a larger number concerns me more, that they're capable of potentially overwhelming our higher quality ships. So that's why you hear a lot of, particularly on the Republican side, but on both sides, some Democrats as well, calling for us to build more ships. We need more planes and ships out there, particularly in the Pacific, if we're ever going to counter China's rise.
Would it be fair to say that, the issue of China, or recognizing the threat of China, is now a bipartisan issue in Washington, D.C.?
I think so. I think it definitely is. I think you saw that in banning TikTok. I think we recognize that China poses a threat to us. Where I would say it's a bipartisan issue. I don't think this administration is taking it seriously. Unfortunately, there's a lot more they could be doing. But I think at least in Congress, it seems to be a bipartisan issue. And the China Select Committee has made great strides in kind of bringing this to the forefront. Whether it's just in the last 2 weeks, they're talking about every aspect of the threat China poses, from whether it's TP-Link, these routers that are in a lot of places in American infrastructure that are Chinese made, to cranes at our ports. The China Select Committee is doing a ton of work. I'd also call out their focus on the Education Committee, bipartisan work on the Education Committee to call out China's influence in our education system. Parents Defending Education, a nonprofit here in DC, has done a lot of work on this to expose how much China is influencing, not just in our higher education, but our K through 12 schools as well. This is only happening, all this kind of exposure and talk about China's influence is only happening because it's been a bipartisan issue.
Could you walk me through, in the audience, through some of the other threats that China poses to the United States? We already talked about kind of the military, but I think of the economy as well, maybe being over reliant on Chinese production and how that affected the US and the supply chain post pandemic. I think of cybersecurity, we kind of touched on TikTok, but what are some of the, I guess, top categories or ways in which China poses a threat to the US?
Well, I think there's so many ways. It's I was gonna jump in and start talking about fentanyl, right? Because they're flowing counterfeit fentanyl into Mexico and then across our southern border. They're literally poisoning us. They are buying, by the low end estimates, they bought 350,000 acres of farmland, and people say, well, there's about 80 million acres of farmland in the United States, arable land in the United States. What's 350,000 acres? That's not that much, but it means a lot when it's 50,000 acres that are surrounding Laughlin Air Force Base in South Texas, where the majority of our fighter pilots are trained, or it's around a nuclear base in Wyoming, or in South Dakota, or around a bomber base in Missouri. They're strategically buying up land to surround these places. I would say in South Texas, in Laughlin Air Force Base, they bought 50,000 acres around Del Rio, and bought a few tens of thousands of acres on the Mexico side of the border. So now they have land on either side of the border surrounding a military base. And they said it was a Chinese company. First, it was a straight Chinese firm. The ranchers didn't want to sell their land. Then they bought an American firm, sent the American firm in there to buy the land, and then they revealed that it was actually a Chinese firm. Once they did this, they said they want to build wind turbines. They're going to do clean energy because the Chinese care so much about clean energy in America that they want to build these wind turbines to provide clean energy for Del Rio, which is just on the surface insane. But they didn't have any high tension power lines. They didn't have any roads. There was no infrastructure to build this stuff there. They started building kind of cement structures and a runway. Why you need that stuff for wind turbine field, nobody knows. Thankfully, the FBI stepped in, and others stepped in and got involved in this. Senator Cruz, Senator Cornyn, and others stepped in to try to slow this down and stop it. CFIUS. But the issue is that they're using the quote unquote liberal rules based world order. They're using that against us. They're using our love of individual rights and property rights against us, and infiltrating everywhere. What we saw for a number of years with the Confucius Institutes was their ability to say, we're going to fund a cultural exchange center in American universities. We're going to turn over millions of dollars out of the kindness of our hearts to teach people to speak Mandarin at universities. And then we found out that these were just jump points for them to uh, manage a spying operation. That was extremely extensive. I don't want to kind of just keep hammering Texas here, but at MD Anderson in Houston, they basically had paid off several doctors and scientists and set up a replica lab in China. And they were paying these doctors to do their research at MD Anderson, fly the results back over to their replica lab of the exact same lab that they had at MD Anderson, and try to steal the advancement that they were making in cancer research. And this ultimately was shut down by Secretary Pompeo under the Trump administration when they closed the Chinese consulate in Houston for this massive spying operation that they were doing into just patients at a hospital, into cancer patients at a hospital, to try to steal technology. They're just constantly using our system against us. And I think that actually plays into some of the isolationism and the protectionism that we see in America. Is like these rules that we're adhering to are these international organizations that oftentimes the United States is the main backer of, are not helpful to us, right? They're actually hurting us. In a relevant contemporary context, like if we took the ICJ, right? And now I know we're not a party to that, but we are a party to many international organizations. And right now, the ICJ is going after Israel far more than it is after the two terrorist organizations that keep attacking Israel. So I think to the average American that sees this, is they say, why would we want to continue to engage with international organizations like this that are using our own kind of services and entities against us and putting us on our back foot? Wouldn't it be better to withdraw from these places and fight on our own terms against these other nations? I'll give one more, and I know I've talked for a lot, but if you looked at the organization that basically does civil aviation around the globe, it's like the UN version of civil aviation. It's based in Canada. China got the seat. They won the votes. They bought the votes in the UN for that seat to be in charge of that. And they immediately came into the building and ripped out all of the kind of IT infrastructure and put in their own infrastructure inside of that building to now spy. They did the same kind of with the patent office. They did the same situation in Africa with what is basically like a Center for Disease Control in Africa, where the United States had invested tens of millions of dollars into research in Africa, disease research in Africa, and then China came in there and took it over and stole it all, and shipped it back to China for their own research and for their own use, which I can guarantee you won't be as altruistic as the United States kind of investment in those things are. So it's kind of all around the world that they're nefarious purposes and entities backed by China, and not just China, but Russia and Iran to a lesser extent. And America is reluctant to kind of stop it all.
I do. I actually have a graph of the land grabs that you were mentioning. I think it shows the real and growing threat, which is why I personally get frustrated that the focus is on like Israel and Ukraine. I'm like, why aren't we talking about stuff like this, which is a huge threat to American security? Hearing you talk, I feel like the United States has shifted into playing defense with China instead of playing the offensive. What can the United States do to kind of change that and come up with a strategy that prevents? Like, I'm shocked that we didn't prevent them from buying and purchasing all this land. I know there's laws in place that allow for people, like you mentioned, like they're kind of using our own freedoms against us. But how did we get here?
So I think there's things that we can initially do. One of the things I'd say, if you ask how we got here, allowing China into the WTO and giving them most favored nation status is probably one of the largest kind of foreign policy blunders that we've seen going forward. The idea that China is still considered a developing nation right now, can still take loans from the World Bank as a developing nation that we're effectively going to fund. And what China is doing with those loans is that they're taking them and then they're loaning at much higher interest rates to actual developing nations. They're using this international organization kind of against itself, and doing a new version of kind of like gunboat diplomacy around the world, threatening people, Sri Lanka and Madagascar and others, the Maldives, with terrible loan deals. We can stop that. We have the ability to stop that. We have the ability to push back. We have the ability to actually go into the UN and knock heads around and stop this, to stop Chinese appointees from getting to the head of the organization I mentioned, ICAO, to stop them from getting to the head of that. Why is there's any other nation in the world could be the head of that, right? It could be somebody from Belgium, for all I care. Or a number of nations from South America or Africa would love to have somebody at the head of that organization. But we allow China to kind of buy up these votes and take over these organizations that we invest in, that we are the main backers of. Domestically, I think we need to start ripping Chinese infrastructure out of our infrastructure. That means our ports. That means our IT. That definitely means within the defense industry. We have to get Chinese technology out of it. It's not going to be used for anything good. That's number two. I think number three is that we need to stop China from dumping their goods into our market. And Donald Trump is actually quite good on this, and he gets a lot of flack for the imposition of tariffs, particularly from the right, because as conservatives and free market people, we don't like tariffs. But tariffs, if we take just his first 4 years, he used those as a negotiating tactic, imposing tariffs on goods from China that we make in the United States. If we make it and China makes it, then there should be a tariff on it because we want our people buying. If we're making it here, now if there's something that we don't make, if it's some cheap good, I don't need tariffs on the cheap toys that my kids buy from Target. I don't care about that stuff. But high end goods, there's zero reason why we can't have a negotiation on this. And Trump said just the other day that his first call would be to Xi. And I think that's the right move. That the first thing that we need to do to get our house in order is to start pushing back on all the nefarious things that China is doing to undermine our position as the world leader.
When did the United States policy, or what administration kind of shifted with our attitudes towards China? Was it the Obama administration? Because I'm trying to think back to when we kind of adopted this idea of international liberalism, of increased economic cooperation and interdependence. Do you know when about that happened?
Yeah. So, I mean, I actually would go further back and I would point to Jimmy Carter and the Taiwan Relations Act. I also think that Nixon does a lot. As much as I like President Nixon, he does a lot to open the door to China. And throughout that time period and even into Reagan, there's a belief, and it continues through HW and into Clinton years, that China is going to liberalize. The more we open up to China, China will liberalize and that they'll change because the free market system will change them. Access to it will change them. So it actually starts with Carter and the Taiwan Relations Act there, and then it continues through. And for some reason, we continued through all the presidents until I'd say President Trump. I mean, President Obama is almost embarrassingly so railroaded by China. If you remember, in the last year of his administration, he flies to China and he's left waiting on the tarmac for I forget how long, but an extended period of time where they won't bring out the jet bridge to him. They want him to just walk down his own stairs and come out off the plane, and he's just left there waiting. No reception for him to arrive. It's just, and the Chinese know what they're doing. They're very big on kind of the symbolism of things, and they were doing it to embarrass him. Right now, we're seeing it with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, where he cannot get a meeting with the Chinese government. He has not been, and they keep refusing. If he offers a meeting, they give somebody below his level. They give one below his level because they say, no, you're not at the same level of our Secretary of State. They're doing this to embarrass the administration, and the world sees it, and it should be embarrassing to all of us. But I think that continues all the way through. Obama, he tries to do his pivot to Asia. It falls flat on its face. It's terrible. Pivot is the wrong word for a whole number of reasons that they should not have used in that pivot, meaning like you're turning away from other areas to turn towards China. It's a bad idea. You don't see any of that rhetoric from President Trump on a pivot to China. He just says we're going to counter China and we're going to be tough on China. And the American people, to counter this idea that isolationism runs deep in America, it does not. The American public loves the idea that we're going to be tough on China. It's one of the highest polling things. If you look at deep red states where you'd think isolationism is higher, particularly in Arkansas, there's a poll out of there maybe 4 or 5 years ago where they said maybe less than that, but it said, you would like your senator more if he were more favorable or more praiseworthy of Donald Trump, or they had all these things listed. Number one on that poll was tough on China. If you knew your senator was tough on China, that was the thing they wanted most. So I think Donald Trump is actually responding to that. He's tapped into that desire. The Democrats would be smart to do the same thing. I think some of them understand it. A few in the Senate and maybe a few more in the House understand this, and they're trying to get on board. But this administration, particularly the Democrat one that preceded it in the Obama administration, did not grasp that concept.
Do you think the hope that China would liberalize kind of came from the fall of the Cold War and this idea that, the West had won and democracy had won out, and that eventually China would adopt that? Because I just can't imagine a world in which that was a really good policy. But I guess the historical context of a post-Cold War world would make sense.
It's almost an illiterate reading of history and how the fall of the Soviet Union happened. The fall of the Soviet Union didn't happen because they opened up to free market powers, and that's what caused them to collapse. And we should also recognize that it didn't work because they're not a full democracy, right? They're effectively still a dictatorship, and still invading the nations around them. So it didn't work. And I don't know why it's still at graduate schools across the country, including the one that I went to. They still teach that, this idea that, we'll liberalize the rest of the world. We will be so democratic that everyone will want to be just like us. It's just not the way the world works. There are bad actors in this world, and they're going to do bad things. And we need to be as strong as we can to ensure that we're number one in charge, and that we're able to counter the actions of bad states.
I really quickly want to turn to Israel and China, and how, even though on the surface they might not seem like they have any sort of connection, how does U.S. support for Israel deter Chinese aggression? I'm thinking specifically of Taiwan. And I know that also that's kind of a big argument for support in Ukraine, that China is looking at how the United States responds and supports its allies. And would they do the same in Taiwan?
I was just at a conference today where this was a big discussion, right? Is defending Taiwan, is the juice worth the squeeze? I think this polls particularly high. It doesn't poll as high as protecting Israel. I think much of the desire to protect Israel comes from just a faith-based belief in the United States that particularly evangelicals and thankfully to a growing number of Catholics like myself, there's a kind of growing and expanding Christian Zionist movement in the world that understands how important Israel is. There's not such a connection in Taiwan, right? The connection to Taiwan and why Taiwan is so important to us has much more to do with an economic factor, particularly on chips, semiconductors, and in a larger defense architecture of why Taiwan matters in the first island chain, and the idea of it as MacArthur said, the world's largest stationary aircraft carrier. So I think the two have some relation, but it's not apples to apples when we're trying to compare support for Israel and support for Taiwan. What I would say is that every time America fails to protect an ally, let's take the case of Afghanistan. We spend 20 years in this country building an army, fighting alongside them. You can't say that the Afghan army is not our allies when we have American troops fighting next to them for 20 straight years. And then in effectively what is 60 days, right, July and August in 2021, the Biden administration just dismantles that relationship, abandons them, and we see the absolute decline in Afghanistan with Taliban rule, where just recently they were burning musical instruments in the streets. Women aren't allowed to talk. It is like the downfall of any kind of Western value that you would see that we tried to instill there for 20 years. And within 6 months of that disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan, you see Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Very similar to 6 months after Obama's disastrous withdrawal from Iraq that saw the rise of ISIS, Vladimir Putin invades Crimea, his first invasion of Ukraine. These things are linked, not because it's just 6 months and it happens to be a coincidence. Vladimir Putin moved forces close to the border of Ukraine, and then he pulled them back because there was an international response that looked like it was building. Then Afghanistan happens, and he sees kind of the feckless nature of this administration, and he immediately moves those troops and starts stockpiling goods and materials on the border of Ukraine to go back in 6 months later. Absolutely, he saw the withdrawal and America not standing by an ally as the reason to go forward. So I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan is definitely linked to an invasion in Ukraine. A failure in Israel, I think, would have similar implications to an invasion in Taiwan. America has to stand with its allies. And I would just add one more point to this, at the risk of going on for too long, is that we have taught the world some terrible lessons about how we treat our friends just over the last decade, let's say. Vladimir Putin in Syria has taught the world a different lesson. Bashar al-Assad gave Vladimir Putin every reason and justification to abandon that friendship and that relationship. And Russia stayed right by their side. Iran has done similar things with their friends in the region. We come in for a little while when it's convenient for us, and then we back away. And then we come in for a while and we back away. And we teach the rest of the world that we're not reliable when we do that. When we stand with the Kurds and we are shoulder to shoulder with the Kurds when they're fighting ISIS, and then the second ISIS is defeated, we say, I think we're going to leave here. And if the Turks roll into you guys and mow you guys down, it's not our problem anymore. It's somebody else's. That's not a good lesson to teach the rest of the world. I think much of our kind of myopic foreign policy affects a larger picture that we're not willing to fully grasp or at least acknowledge.
I think that's so important. I want to pivot, to use Obama's words, to Russia. And I think it was, as you mentioned, because the term pivot really means turning away from something else. And I believe it was in his presidential debate with Mitt Romney where he said, the Russia threat is dead. Like we're turning to Asia, we're turning to China. And while I think the threat of Russia is a little less evident to the average American, there is still a threat that Russia poses. And I think perhaps most importantly in the China, Iran, Russia alliance that has formed, especially since the war in Ukraine, I think Russia thought it would be a really quick war. It has not been a quick war. And as a result, they've been isolated through sanctions from the West, which has, caused them to turn to China, Iran. What are the dangers of that axis, that alliance forming to the Western order and to the United States?
I think people are starting to call it now this axis of chaos. And I don't know how I feel about that term. There's parts of it that I really like. I think what we're seeing in the world, the war in Israel, which is now expanding into the north, as it should, because Hezbollah needs to be dealt with. The largest land war we've seen in Europe since World War II, and then the Chinese aggression and encroachment on their neighbors. We're seeing Chinese naval vessels ram the Philippine Coast Guard, and the building of islands to kind of isolate our allies in the region. I think all of this is kind of chaotic. The reason I hesitate on whether or not I like that axis of chaos thing is that chaos implies that it's not organized. It is absolutely organized. They know exactly what they're doing, and they all have a plan for what they're in and what their ultimate goal is. For China, in kind of the short to near term, that's to take Taiwan. For Russia, it's to reestablish the Soviet Union, meaning that Ukraine is first. Then it's probably Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and then maybe parts of Poland as well. And for Iran, that's the destruction of Israel. That's their goal, a regional hegemony. And those three nations, while they might be strange bedfellows because one's a theocracy, one is a dictatorship that's a revisionist power, and one is the last major Marxist-Leninist government in the world, major one in the world. They don't have much in common, um, except for their hatred of the West. And I would just put out that this last week we saw President Biden give a speech at the UN, and if you were to contrast that with the speech by um, the Prime Minister of Italy, um, she spoke a lot. Maloney spoke a lot about Western values and why they matter, why Western civilization, Western society matters. Biden did not. He spoke more of multilateralism, multiculturalism, stuff like that, kind of word salad stuff. Um, there is something that matters about the West. And the thing that we need to understand about Russia or China or all is that they despise the West and they do not want our culture around the world. Um, if you care, particularly those on the right who might be more isolationist leaning, if you care about Western civilization, if you care about Western culture, then you will not want it subjugated or dominated by these other powers, these revisionist powers. That's exactly what they're seeking, right? Western civilization starts in Israel. Iran wants to destroy that place. Um, Western civilization moves into Europe and establishes itself and grows in Europe. Vladimir Putin wants to destroy that. And if you think that somehow that's just going to stop with those two, and it's not going to come for what is now the pinnacle of Western society in America, it will eventually come here. And all three of them would love to get to that point where they can kind of surround and isolate the pinnacle of Western society, which they hate.
Is it also fair to say that these revisionist powers, this axis of chaos, um, no longer fear the United States in the way that they once did?
They might fear the United States. They don't fear this administration. Um, I think if you if you see, um, a Department of Defense that is more focused on DEI than it is on warfighting, that's not a serious Department of Defense, and they're not going to. They have no reason to take it seriously. If you see uh, a small terrorist organization, that owns, um, let's say, 40% of one of the poorest countries in the world, Yemen, firing rocket after rocket at our naval vessels, and we're offering almost no response. Our naval ships are under the largest amount of combat that they've been in since World War II in that area, and we're offering no response. That indicates to much larger powers, China or Russia or whoever, that we're not going to take this threat seriously, and all we want to do is avoid conflict. President Biden regularly talks, and his administration as well talks. All of it, Sullivan and Blinken, they all talk about their fear of escalation. We don't want things to escalate. We don't want this to escalate anymore. They hammer Netanyahu on this. They go after Zelensky on this. Don't fire rockets into Russia because that would escalate. But if that's their stance, then they've already turned kind of what we used to talk about in the 80s as escalation dominance. We've already turned escalation dominance over to our adversaries. They are now in charge of escalation, and we are having to respond to whatever they do. That's not how any self-respecting superpower should act. We, as the superpower, we control escalation dominance. You have to respond to us when we escalate, and we are going to over escalate so that there are real consequences for testing us as a superpower. They're not taking us seriously because we don't understand that concept of escalation.
Makes me think of the most recent article that you wrote, which I referenced at the beginning of the episode, about the unfortunate death of Hirsch Goldberg Poland, who was one of the hostages taken on October 7th. And I think this concept of not taking at least this administration seriously and having, waning hard and soft power abroad was seen in the failed hostage negotiations, especially for American citizens after October 7th. Could you talk a little bit about your article and some of the points you made about how, holding US citizenship abroad doesn't mean the same thing that it used to, doesn't come with those same protections?
Yeah, I mean, my basic argument is just that the citizens of a superpower historically held particular protections. This is most notably recognized during the Roman Empire. And we see it um, in the Bible with Saint Paul. He's arrested and he says, "I'm a Roman citizen." And the people who arrest him are terrified that they put their hands and they put in chains a Roman citizen. That same concept is carried through history, and there's example after example of people talking about it, all the way up to in as it pertains to anti-Semitism and attacks on Jewish people. In 1850, there's a Jewish citizen in Athens, Greece, who was attacked by an anti-Semitic mob, and the Foreign Secretary Henry Lord Temple, he sends the British Navy to blockade Greece. This is like now what's taught in American foreign policy schools is that's gunboat diplomacy. It's awful, and we were subjugating the small country at the whim of the British Empire. But no, it's the British Empire saying you don't touch our citizens. You do not touch British citizens. And we recognize this all the way up through President Kennedy makes the same point. The Latin phrase for I'm a Roman citizen that's used in the Bible, that's used by Henry Temple. He makes this at the Berlin Wall. This idea that this is a proud boast. You are the citizen of a superpower, and you are not to be touched. We have lost that, and unfortunately, what we're telling the world through the policies of this administration is that American citizens are worth a lot of money. We'll pay a lot of money. We'll give you whatever you want. We'll prioritize payment over punishment. We will not punish you. And if you kill an American citizen like Hirsch Goldberg Poland, we're actually going to tell the world how we will not respond. We're not going to send in our troops to go after you and punish you for that. We're going to put it on another country. Israel is going to have to go do it, even though Hirsch is a dual citizen. Israel will defend him and not us. That's a sad thing for all American citizens who want to travel abroad. We should feel like our country has our back, not that we're some bargaining chip that we're going to be traded, for a arms dealer, as Brittany Griner was, or an assassin, as Evan Gershkovich was from the Wall Street Journal. A convicted assassin who shot a man in the back in the middle of Tiergarten in Berlin, and he was traded for a reporter who was just, doing a story in Moscow. We've unfortunately lost the respect that a superpower used to have in the world because we keep paying every time somebody kidnaps one of our citizens.
Well, in closing, I was going to ask a really loaded question, which is how do we reinstate that supremacy as a global power? And then looking to 6 weeks from now, which I can't believe the election's in 6 weeks, what are some of the counterfactuals with the different respective administrations? I mean, obviously, we know with the Biden-Harris administration, it would probably, or sorry, Harris-Walz administration, it would probably be a continuation of the Biden-Harris administration. We also have the previous Trump administration to look at as well as kind of a blueprint of what a post-November America might look like.
Well, I think that Trump actually regained a lot of the superpower status very quickly in his administration. If you remember when he says, Assad should not be gassing his people and we'll have a response. Assad gasses his people and Trump sends 50 Tomahawk missiles, 52 or something like that, into an airbase in Syria. And then does it again when Assad's like, well, maybe he only did that once and I'm going to gas some more, drop more barrel bombs on my own civilians. Trump responds again. When Iran stepped out of line, they prosecuted the strike on Qasem Soleimani. Trump did a kind of fantastic job of getting superpower status back into the respected column in a very short time. And it to us, it seems like very pragmatic. Like, well, if they act out, then they're punished. It's like being a parent. If my child acts out or throws a temper tantrum, they don't get a reward. They get punished. They get put in timeout, or they get sent to the room. That's how kind of American policy should act. I actually think that, and I don't want to get too political here. Maybe I can, I'll put on my VOD hat instead of or Hudson hat instead of the TPIF hat. But I would say that I think a Harris-Walz administration would almost be the worst inclinations of American foreign policy. I think President Biden, for all of his faults on foreign policy, his inclination, his initial inclination, was to be on a certain side that traditionally America has been on, left or right. Right, support for Israel is the perfect picture of this. He comes out a few days after October 7th and is like, "We are standing with Israel." I think much of his staff that represent the kind of base of the Democratic Party don't have that similar inclination. I do not think Harris has that inclination. I think she's inclined the other direction to say, we shouldn't support Israel, and I'm just going to have to do it now while Biden's here. But as soon as he's gone, I can kind of change things up. And I think the staff that's supporting Biden, that is not particularly aligned to where he is as a more kind of centrist Democrat, the staff surrounding him, the staff that will absolutely make up a Harris-Walz cabinet, are much more inclined to say America needs to atone for its sins, Israel needs to atone for their sins, and therefore we need to punish ourselves and punish Israel, and we need to raise up some of these countries that have gotten a bad rap over the last few years, like Iran. I think they're very, 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 very much predisposed to being soft and lenient with Iran and tough on Israel, which is extremely unfortunate.
It is. I feel like a Harris-Walz administration would look pretty similar to if all the faculty at a very liberal university were running the country, and their their policies are to divest, destruct. We've had Hussein Mansour on to talk about how there's really no vision beyond the destruction and the tearing down, very postmodern kind of way of looking at the United States and the West, and there is no vision after that, and it's a scary, scary reality. So God help us in the next 6 weeks. My feelings about the election, I think, are pretty evident on the podcast. But Garrett, thank you so much for coming on and explaining just this really both vast and historic and complex topic, such as isolationism, to the audience. How can the audience find your work and follow you?
Yeah, I am on LinkedIn only. I don't do Twitter or Instagram or anything like that. I think it's a little bit too caustic for me. I fall too much down the dark rabbit hole, but I'm on LinkedIn, Garrett Exner. You can find me there. I post most of my stuff there. I would also recommend you look at Veterans on Duty, where we post a lot of the kind of policy stuff that we're putting out, and of course everything at Hudson Institute. Everything I write, every podcast like this is posted there under the scholars page at Hudson Institute.
Amazing. And I just encourage everyone in our network to check out TPIF as well, because they have some amazing fellowships and programs.
Thank you for reminding that. I should have made that plug earlier.
Yeah. No, and I'm enjoying it because I'm in a fellowship this year. I'm finally in a TPIF fellowship. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the semester, for lack of a better term.
First of multiple fellowships, I hope.
Yes. I'm going to become one of those people who's like, all right, you have to stop applying because you've done too many of these fellowships. But I can't recommend TPIF enough. So thank you so much, Garrett. And hopefully we'll have you on soon.
Thank you for having me. Always a great place to be.
Thank you for watching this week's episode of the Philos Project podcast. If you would like to learn more about U.S. foreign policy, I encourage you to check out our Pathfinder course taught by Walter Russell Mead. And if you want to have an even more in-depth reading of American foreign policy, I encourage you to pick up Walter Russell Mead's book, Special Providence, which explains the different schools of foreign policy. And there's even some context for isolationism there. The Philos Project is a nonprofit. If you feel so led to give to educational offerings such as the Philos Project podcast, I will leave a link in the description box below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe. And if you have any thoughts on today's podcast, please leave a comment. I will see you next week.